Hello and welcome to another Canadian Express training video. Today we're going to be talking about contacting ATC. Many folks have expressed fears and hesitation regarding flying online when ATC is present. This video is intended to ease those fears and get you flying with ATC in no time. Let's roll. First, the disclaimer. This video is intended for flight simulation purposes only. No aspects of this video should be used for real-world flight. Now on with the rest of the video. The first question that most people ask, when do I need to contact ATC? Well, there are a few considerations that need to be answered first. Am I at a controlled airport? What type of flight plan do I intend to file? And finally, is ATC even online? Let's answer that last question first. If ATC is not online, then contacting ATC is obviously a moot point. All communications are thus handled over Unicom in a text format to inform other online pilots what your intentions are. Since this is a video about contacting ATC, we won't talk anymore about ATC offline procedures. Let's go back to the first question regarding controlled airports. If you are at a controlled airport, you must contact ATC regardless of your flight plan type in order to receive clearance for taxi, takeoff, and navigation through the controlled airspace. The next question regarding the type of flight plan that you intend to file. If you're filing an IFR flight plan, then you must always contact ATC for clearance regardless of whether or not you're at a controlled airport or not. If you are at or nearing an uncontrolled airport, ATC will provide a special clearance for takeoff or landing with instruction on when to be in contact with them. There's more to follow on that later on in the video about that. If your IR flights are to and from controlled airports only, you will be in continuous contact with air traffic control. If you're filing a VFR flight plan, then as stated earlier, you only need to contact ATC if you're departing or arriving at a controlled airport. If you're flying to and from uncontrolled airports, you do not need to contact ATC, but you should let other pilots know what you're up to by posting your intentions to Unicom, as this best simulates VFR pilots broadcasting on Unicom radio channels as they near uncontrolled airports in the real world. So for those of you wondering how to tell if an airport is controlled or not, well, the simple rule is that airports that are inside controlled airspace are controlled airports. This can be determined by looking at VFR sectional charts, for which there are many resources on the internet for VFR charts. A few to try are skyvector.com or flightplan.com, which both provide free access to sectional charts. While this video is not intended to be a complete resource on airspace classification, we will do a summary of airspace and airports only to be able to tell if they are controlled airports or not. Let's look at the airport itself on the sectional chart. If the symbol for the airport itself is magenta in color, this indicates it is a non-towered airport. There can be several different symbols for the airport depending on the configuration of the airport, but the magenta always means non-towered airport. If the airport symbol is depicted in blue, then it indicates there is a control tower in operation at the airport, and as all towered airports have a control zone, they are thus inside some class of controlled airspace. Class B controlled airspace is found around the largest and busiest airports. These are indicated by having a solid blue airspace border marking the Class B area. Class C controlled airports are typically around larger to intermediate sized airports, and the volumes of air traffic is a little bit lighter. They are indicated on VFR sectional charts by having a solid magenta airspace border marking the Class C area. Class D controlled airspace is identified with a dashed blue airspace border marking. Class D airports are smaller airports, very little traffic, but still require contact with air traffic control in order to enter the airspace. Class B, C, and D airspace extends all the way to the ground at the airport, so regardless of your flight plan type, you need to contact ATC prior to entering the airspace. Airports that have Class E airspace that extend all the way to the ground will have a dashed magenta airspace border marking, and while it is considered controlled airspace and ATC is available, it is not required for VFR flights unless SVFR rules are in effect. Airports that have Class E airspace surrounding them, but the airspace does not extend all the way to the ground, typically the airspace starts at 700 feet mean sea level and goes up from there, they are depicted typically with a thick magenta gradient shaded ring, and the rules of Class E airspace apply if you're flying above that floor of the airspace, again typically 700 feet, but there are some zones that start at 1200 feet, those rules still apply. If you fly into the airport in these zones below the 700-foot mark or below the floor of the airspace, you are not in any controlled airspace, and as such, you do not need to contact ATC to land at the airport unless you are flying IFR. Class G airspace is completely uncontrolled airspace. Airports without any controlled airspace are by nature uncontrolled. These will be small rural airports, typically with very light traffic only. This shot is of Lac La Tortue Airport and Waterdrome near Grande-Mère, Quebec. Both the airport and the Waterdrome are colored in magenta, indicating non-towered airports. Uncontrolled airports that are nearby larger controlled airports may have an area of the larger airport's controlled airspace cut out so that the airspace surrounding the airport, the smaller airport that is, can be uncontrolled. A good example of this is the Debert Airport, which would have been inside of Halifax's Class B airspace, but since the exclusion area has been made, the airspace around this uncontrolled airport is also uncontrolled airspace. Anyhow, that's enough on airspace classification and controlled versus non-controlled airports for this video. Next, we're going to talk about who to be in contact first when contacting ATC. First, we will preface the remainder of this video by stating that all references and instruction in this video is per VATSIM rules and procedures. If you fly on the IVAO network, generally speaking, the same rules will apply. Well, I've loaded up my simulator and I've connected to the network, and I see there are multiple air traffic controllers online. Who do I contact first? There are two things that we need to look at. Are the controllers who are showing up in my controller list responsible for the area in which I am flying? And which of the controllers who are controlling in my area do I contact first? Let's look at that issue first. It's called the hierarchy of control. In the VATSIM simulation world, not all positions are staffed full-time like they are in the real world, so VATSIM controllers will take the responsibility for positions that are not staffed. We will look at the positions by relative rank, with the subsequent list of positions being able to staff the preceding positions. In the controllers list, the rank of the controller will be indicated by the last three letters in their ATC call sign, with the first three or four letters of the call sign being the ICAO code of the airport they're controlling, or the flight information region to which they are controlling. For example, Toronto Ground's call sign would be CYYZ_GND. Ranks are as follows in the ascending rank order. 1. Clearance delivery. These guys do not control airspace as such, rather they issue clearances for flight plans primarily to IFR aircraft. In the real world, clearance delivery controllers would also issue clearances for VFR traffic, but this is not always the case for the VATSIM world. This is the rank that is least often staffed, being the most limited rank of the hierarchy. The second one is ground. Ground controllers are responsible for aircraft movement on the ground at the airport, except for the active runways. Once a pilot has their flight plan clearance and are ready to depart the airport, they will contact the ground controller, who would give them taxi instructions up to a hold short of a runway. Ground controllers are not authorized to permit aircraft to enter onto active runways, And if there's no delivery controller online, the ground controller will assume and fill that role. The third position is tower. Tower controllers primarily control active runways, issue takeoff and landing clearances, and are responsible for maintaining separation of aircraft on final approach and takeoffs. If delivery or ground are not staffed, then the tower controller will fulfill their duties. If ground is online, tower will hand off the pilot to ground, typically as the pilot is leaving the runway after landing. If a higher ranking position is online, tower will instruct the pilot once airborne to contact that controller for further ATC coverage and instruction. The fourth position is approach and departure. Approach and departure controllers are typically found at larger airport locations and control the Class B or Class C airspace immediately surrounding the airport. As the title indicates, they are either in charge of all the aircraft approaching the airport or all the aircraft that have departed the airport. In certain cases, for most intermediate-sized airports, these positions are sometimes combined into a single position, which is then called terminal, although the position will still have the last three letters of APP. An example of this is Halifax Terminal, CYHZ_APP. If none of the tower rank positions are online for that particular airport, the approach controller will handle all of the duties of tower and ground. The last is center. Center controllers control large areas called Area Route Traffic Control Centers, or ARTCCs, and they provide control for all IFR traffic en route in their airspace. Center controllers coordinate with lower-ranking controllers at airports in the ARTCC, or if they're not online, they assume control for all controlled airports in their ARTCC. So to recap, if there are controllers online at the airport that I'm flying out of, I would start with the clearance delivery controller if online. Otherwise, I would keep moving up the rank of controllers to the first position that is staffed for that airport. If you are flying IFR and departing from an uncontrolled airport, you would contact the center controller directly for IFR clearance. As to the question of whether the controllers that are online are responsible for the area in which you are flying, again, their call sign will indicate the area for which they are responsible, be that a position at an airport or a center position of an ARTCC. If you're still unsure after that if they're providing ATC for the area in which you intend to fly, there are a couple of choices of programs that you can run to show controllers who are online on a map of the globe, such as VATAware, VATSpy, and the most preferred one, which is VATtastic, which is also web-based and also overlays the current real-world weather over the radar map. Well, it's one thing to know who to contact, but what to say to them is a whole different thing, right? Well, not really. But the first time talking to online ATC can be a bit intimidating to some pilots who don't want to feel foolish by saying the wrong thing. The first thing to come to grips with is that everyone online has gone through this before, including the controllers themselves. Remember, they put their pants on one leg at a time just like you do. Most controllers will be courteous and respectful and are more than willing to help you learn if you're open to some coaching and constructive critique of your commentary. Also remember that ATC controllers are not paid staff members. They are volunteers with a love of aviation simulation who have put a ton of effort into becoming good ATC controllers. So please also be respectful of them as well. Before we contact ATC, we must have filed a flight plan regardless of whether we are flying VFR or IFR. There are several clients that will connect you to the VATSIM environment, and they all allow you to file a flight plan. Examples of clients for connection to the network are vPilot, FSN, and SquawkBox. If you want to let your ATC controller know that you are new to online ATC, simply put the word newbie in the remarks section of your flight plan, and they will see it and help you out accordingly. First, let's examine a typical exchange between a pilot and ATC for a VFR flight plan, as it is the simplest communication between a pilot and ATC, yet sometimes the most confused by pilots as it's a little less structured than communication with ATC on an IFR flight plan. Remember, we've already filed a flight plan. For this example, the flight plan we filed is for a flight from Halifax International Airport, CYHZ, to Stanley Airport, CCW4, at an altitude of 2,500 feet, thus departing from a controlled airport and flying to an uncontrolled airport. the pilot will initiate contact with ATC when they're ready. Typically for a VFR flight, you want to be ready to go with your engines running when you contact ATC, as you're typically going to be asking them to taxi you right away. Hey, everybody buckled up? Okay, let me get a hold of ATC and we'll get rolling here shortly.
Halifax ground, Canadian Express 480, requesting taxi to the active for VFR departure to the north.
Canadian Express 480, Halifax ground, good morning. Will you be requiring a flight following today?
That is negative for Canadian Express 480.
Canadian Express 480, VFR is approved, not above 2,500 feet, Squawk 1201. Taxi via apron at your discretion. Golf, Foxtrot, cross runway 14, Foxtrot, hold short runway 23.
Canadian Express 480 has 1201 in the box, taxiing via apron, Golf, Foxtrot, cross 14, Foxtrot, hold short 23.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. The pilot initially contacted ATC by calling out the controller's position by name, giving his own call sign, followed by the request of what they were looking for.
Halifax ground, Canadian Express 480, requesting taxi to the active for VFR departure to the north.
This was returned with the controller responding by repeating the aircraft's call sign so that the pilot would know that ATC was talking directly to them and not to another aircraft, followed by the position name for identification. At this point, two-way communication has been established and both parties know who they're talking to. The next thing the controller asked was whether or not the pilot wanted flight following.
Canadian Express 480, Halifax ground, good morning. Will you be requiring flight following today?
Once two-way communication has been established, the communication can now be a little less formal. For instance, the pilot dropped putting the controller's position name in the subsequent communications, as a pilot only talks to one controller at a time, and until instructed otherwise, the pilot stays in communication with that controller, so it is a bit of a moot point to keep repeating the controller's name in every communication. However, a controller may be in contact with multiple aircraft at any time, so it's essential that you always identify yourself in each communication. Recall the response.
That is negative for Canadian Express 480.
The pilot has said that flight following was not required at this time and ensured that ATC knew that it was coming from Canadian Express 480. ATC then responded with the VFR clearance.
Canadian Express 480, VFR is approved, not above 2,500 feet, Squawk 1201. Taxi via apron at your discretion. Golf, Foxtrot, cross runway 14, Foxtrot, hold short runway 23.
Breaking that down a bit, it was clear the instruction was intended for Canadian Express 480 to say that the VFR flight plan was reviewed by the controller and that they are approved to fly through the controlled airspace of the airport control zone at an altitude not to exceed 2,500 feet, which, by the way, was the maximum altitude as filed by the pilot. Then ATC asked that the pilot dial in 1201 into the aircraft's transponder. Default VFR transponder code is 1200 for VFR flight, but if the controller is dealing with multiple VFR flights, he can issue 1201, 1202 squawk codes, etc. Finally, the controller granted approval for the pilot to taxi to the active runway via the apron, then via taxiway Golf Foxtrot across non-operational runway number 14, continue on Foxtrot, and then hold short of runway 23. Anytime a controller says at your discretion in a taxi instruction, it means the controller is not authorized to instruct or it pertains to an area on the airport that is not controlled. In the VATSIM world, airport apron areas are not controlled, so the controller used the phrase taxi via apron at your discretion. The last thing the controller said in that last exchange was hold short runway 23. That means the pilot is authorized to taxi via the stated route all the way up to the runway, but the pilot must stop short of entering the runway at the hold line on the taxiway, or behind any other aircraft in line to take off. Next, the pilot repeats back to ATC the instruction just given so that ATC knows the command has been heard and acknowledged and will be complied with.
Canadian Express 480 has 1201 in the box, taxiing via apron, Golf, Foxtrot, cross 14, Foxtrot, and hold short 23.
With a bit of slang thrown in, CXA-480 has acknowledged that they have coded their transponder, the box, to 1201 and will follow the taxi instructions as stated, holding short of entering runway 23. Note that hold short instructions must always be read back to ATC as these are safety critical instructions. Once you have arrived or nearing the hold short line of the runway, you can expect to hear back from the ground controller.
Canadian Xpress 480. Contact Halifax Tower on 118.4. Have a good flight, sir.
Over to tower now, 118.4, Canadian Xpress 480. Good day. Halifax Tower, Canadian Express 480, holding short, runway 23.
Canadian Express 480, Halifax Tower, airborne, contact Halifax Terminal on 119.2, winds 250 at 8 knots, altimeter 3003, clear for takeoff, runway 23.
Airborne over to Terminal 119.2, check the winds, clear for takeoff, runway 23.
Again, let's break that down into its individual components. The ground controller prompted the pilot that they were approved to change radio frequency to 118.4 and to make contact with the tower controller.
Canadian Xpress 480. Contact Halifax Tower on 118.4.
Again, pilots acknowledge instructions given to them from ATC by repeating the command back to ATC.
Over to tower now, 118.4, Canadian Express 480. Good day.
Since we've been handed off to another controller, it is back on us to make contact with the new controller. Although in the simulation world, the controller can see the call signs of every aircraft that is tuned into their channel, this does not happen in the real world. So in the real world, the responsibility lays with the pilot to let ATC know that they've tuned into their channel and initiate the contact. Since we emulate real world in our simulation, we follow the same rule.
Halifax Tower, Canadian Express 480, holding short, runway 23.
Again, this is the first time that we're speaking to this controller, so we state both the controller position name and our own call sign so that the controller knows we are speaking to him. Once two-way communication has been established, we can again drop the controller's position name from any further communication.
Canadian Express 480, Halifax Tower, airborne, contact Halifax Terminal on 119.2, winds 250 at 8 knots, altimeter 3003, clear for takeoff, runway 23.
By saying that, the tower controller has acknowledged the pilot by call sign, has confirmed the pilot has indeed made contact with Halifax Tower. Next, an instruction was given to the pilot that once airborne, the pilot is instructed to contact Halifax Terminal, the approach departure controller, on frequency 119.2. Tower controllers will always state the current measured wind speed and direction prior to issuing a takeoff or landing clearance. Following the winds, the controller stated the current barometric pressure for the altimeter to be set to. And then lastly, gave clearance or permission for the pilot to take off from runway 23. Now the pilot acknowledges.
Airborne over to Terminal 119.2, check the winds, clear for takeoff, runway 23.
Which translates to, once airborne, I will contact Halifax Terminal on frequency 119.2. I received your update on the wind speed and direction, and that I'm allowed to take off from runway 23.
Halifax Terminal, Canadian Express 480, passing through 1,000 feet for 2,500 feet.
Canadian Express 480, Halifax Terminal, radar identified. Your altitude checks, maintain VFR all times not above 2500.
Maintain VFR not above 2,500, Canadian Express 480.
Translating what we just heard, the pilot has contacted the next controller to let them know they are airborne off the runway. They are currently at an altitude of 1,000 feet mean sea level and climbing to their filed flight plan altitude of 2,500 feet. ATC responded by letting the pilot know that they have them on their control scope, and the pilot's stated altitude is in agreement with the altitude being measured by the radar scope. And then he closes the communications to tell them that they're under their own navigational control, free from ATC control. The pilot acknowledges instruction via read back to the controller. In order to understand when we would be leaving the controller's airspace, let's refer back to the sectional charts for a minute. And the sectional chart for Halifax Airport shows Class D airspace around the airport, which extends out 4 nautical miles from the ground up to 3,500 feet. This Class D airspace overlaps into a Class B airspace, which has a floor starting at 1,700 feet, closer to the airport, up to 12,500 feet. And then the airspace steps up again further out from the airport, where the floor begins at 2,900 feet and continues up to 12,500 feet. If we looked at that airspace from the side, the airspace would look like this graphic, and our flight path through that space would be something like this. That technically means we have left the terminal controller's airspace at this point. From that point on in the flight, we're in non-controlled airspace, so our pilot would then communicate intentions for landing in Stanley on Unicom 122.8.
Canadian Express 480, you're leaving my airspace to the north. Switch to Unicom. Have a good day, sir.
Canadian Express 480.
So here's that entire VFR example from beginning to end one more time.
Halifax ground, Canadian Express 480, requesting taxi to the active for VFR departure to the north.
Canadian Express 480, Halifax ground, good morning. Will you be requiring a flight following today?
That is negative for Canadian Express 480.
Canadian Express 480, VFR is approved. Not above 2,500 feet. Squawk 1201. Taxi via apron at your discretion. Golf, Foxtrot, cross runway 14, Foxtrot, hold short runway 23.
Canadian Express 480 has 1201 in the box, taxiing via apron, Golf, Foxtrot, cross 14, Foxtrot, hold short 23.
Canadian Express 480. Contact Halifax Tower on 118.4. Have a good flight, sir.
Over to tower now, 118.4, Canadian Express 480. Good day. Halifax Tower, Canadian Express 480, holding short, runway 23.
Canadian Express 480, Halifax Tower. Airborne, contact Halifax Terminal on 119.2. Winds 250 at 8 knots, altimeter 3003. Clear for takeoff, runway 23.
Airborne over to terminal 119.2. Check the winds. Clear for takeoff, runway 23. Halifax Terminal, Canadian Express 480, passing through 1,000 feet for 2,500 feet.
Canadian Express 480, Halifax Terminal, radar identified. Your altitude checks. Maintain VFR all times not above 2500.
Maintain VFR not above 2500. Canadian Express 480.
Canadian Express 480, you're leaving my airspace to the north. Switch to Unicom. Have a good day, sir.
Canadian Express 480.
Now let's look at an example for an IFR flight starting at Montreal, CYUL, to Toronto, CYYZ. And for this example, we are again assuming that all ATC positions are staffed. The flow of communications is the same as for VFR flight with respect to the hierarchy of control, starting with the clearance delivery, but the flow of communication from there is a bit more structured for an IFR flight, as there's more information being communicated back and forth for IFR flights. We'll break this down through the following phases of flight: clearance, pushback and start, taxi, takeoff, departure, en route, approach, final, landing, after landing taxi, and park and shutdown. As with our VFR flight, we must have prepared and filed our IFR flight plan before we contact ATC for clearance. Let's go back to the simulator now.
Montreal clearance delivery, Canadian Xpress 480, Boeing 739 with information Alpha ready to copy IFR clearance to Toronto.
Canadian Express 480, Montreal delivery, good day. Cleared to Toronto Airport via the Trudeau 2 departure, vectors to Bobkey, flight planned route, expect runway 24 left, squawk 4501.
Canadian Express 480, Trudeau 2 departure, vectors to Bobkey, flight plan route, expect runway 24 left and squawk 4501.
Canadian Express 480, readback is correct, contact ground on 121.9er for pushback and start.
Roger, 121.9 for pushback and start, Canadian Express 480.
Breaking that down into easier to understand language goes like this.
Montreal clearance delivery, Canadian Express 480, Boeing 739 with information Alpha ready to copy IFR clearance to Toronto.
The pilot has made initial contact with the clearance delivery controller and let them know their call sign is Canadian Express 480. This allows the controller to go through his list of flight plans and find the flight plan for Canadian Express 480. The pilot has also identified his airplane as a Boeing 737-900. The pilot is already tuned into the Montreal ATIS, currently published as Information Alpha, so the pilot should already have an idea of the local weather, the current altimeter setting, and what runways are in use. Lastly, the pilot states they are ready to receive their clearance instructions from ATC.
Canadian Express 480, Montreal delivery, good day. Cleared to Toronto Airport via the Trudeau 2 departure, vectors to Bobkey, flight planned route, expect runway 24 left, squawk 4501.
Clearance Delivery responded to Canadian Express 480 to let them know their clearance is valid all the way to the Toronto Airport and has requested the pilot to follow the Standard Instrument Departure Procedure, or SID, called Trudeau 2. Trudeau 2 requires the pilots fly runway heading after takeoff and climb up to but not in excess of 5,000 feet until further ATC clearance is given. Other restrictions are also in the SID that the pilots must follow, but in general, SIDs for most airports are similar in that most of them are required to fly runway heading and maintain 5,000 feet. The controller added the phrase vectors to Bobkey, which means the pilot can expect vectors by ATC after takeoff to the first waypoint of Bobkey. Then ATC said flight plan route, which means the remainder of the route as filed by the pilot is accepted without any further corrections. The final part of the communication from the delivery controller tells the pilot to expect runway 24 left for takeoff and to set their transponder code 4501.
Canadian Express 480, Trudeau 2 departure, vectors to Bobkey, flight plan route, expect runway 24 left and squawk 4501.
The pilot has acknowledged the instruction from Clearance Delivery by reading it back to the controller.
Canadian Express 480, readback is correct, contact ground on 121.9er for pushback and start.
The key part of this exchange is that the Clearance Delivery controller has told the pilot that readback is correct. Or in other words, I have heard you recall my instructions and you got it correct. When the pilot is ready to push back and start engines, they should call ground on 121.90 for permission. Now that the pilots have all their clearances and instructions understood, they can do the final programming of their flight computers while the remainder of the passengers board the aircraft and they square up the cockpit to ready for flight.
Montreal ground, Canadian Express 480, ready for pushback and start.
Canadian Express 480, pushback and start approved, call for taxi.
Copy, push and start, we'll call for taxi, Canadian Express 480. Montreal ground, Canadian Express 480, ready for taxi 24 left.
Canadian Express 480, runway 24 left, taxi via Alpha Mike, Alpha, advise holding short, runway 24 left, altimeter 29er83.
Runway 24 left, taxi Alpha Mike, Alpha, advise holding short, 24 left, altimeter 29er83, Canadian Express 480. Canadian Express 480, holding short 24 left, ready to go.
Canadian Express 480, contact tower on 119.9er.
Tower 119.9, Canadian Express 480.
One of the key things to glean from that exchange is how clear and concise the choice of words is. There are no unnecessary extra details being discussed. Keeping the conversation clear and concise makes it easier for both parties to understand the communication without having to lose any meaning in the conversation. In the last acknowledgement from the pilot, he simply read back the frequency and his call sign. The controller would know that that meant the pilot understood the instruction to switch frequencies and that the right pilot was acknowledging the instruction.
Montreal Tower, Canadian Express 480, holding short 24 left, ready to go.
Canadian Express 480, airborne call departures 12465, winds 239er at 8, altimeter 29er 83, cleared takeoff, runway 24 left.
Copy the winds, departures on 124.65, clear for takeoff 24 left, Canadian Express 480. Montreal departure, Canadian Express 480, passing 1500 feet, Trudeau 2.
Canadian Express 480, radar identified, passing 1,500. Turn right, heading 280, direct Bob Key on course, climb and maintain 12,000.
Climb and maintain 12,000, right 280, Bob Key on course, Canadian Express 480.
Let's review the exchange that happened just after takeoff. The pilot called the departure controller initiating contact. He stated the altitude at the time, and he also told the controller he was following the SID.
Montreal departure, Canadian Express 480, passing 1500 feet, Trudeau 2.
ATC responded by confirming the scope matches the altitude the pilot reported, and thus the pilot has his or her altimeter pressure setting correct. If there was a large difference in the altitudes, the controller would likely tell the pilot the discrepancy, and the pilot would know to recheck their altimeter pressure setting. By nature that ATC has given a vector to turn right on heading 280 direct to the waypoint Bob Key, the pilot is no longer bound by the SID procedure, and the pilot should now climb to an altitude of 12,000 feet.
Canadian Express 480, radar identified, passing 1,500. Turn right, heading 280, direct Bob Key on course, climb and maintain 12,000.
It's important to note here that even though the pilot filed a cruising altitude of 28,000 feet in their flight plan, this controller's airspace only goes up to 12,000 feet, so the controller can only clear the pilot up to 12,000 feet. As the pilot reaches a point nearing the departure controller's airspace limit, which can be the lateral limit or the ceiling limit of their airspace, the departure controller will hand off the pilot to the center controller.
Canadian Express 480, contact Montreal Center on 128.77, good day.
Center on 128.77, Canadian Express 480. Montreal Center, Canadian Express 480, with you climbing for 12,000, direct Bob Key.
Canadian Express 480, radar identified. Climb and maintain flight level 280, proceed on course.
Flight level 280, proceed on course, Canadian Express 480.
When the pilot is handed off to center, the pilot contacts center and has told the center controller several things using very few words. Let's analyze the contact from the pilot.
Montreal Center, Canadian Express 480, with you climbing for 12,000, direct Bob Key.
The pilot had given the center controller enough information that the controller should be able to pick up his aircraft on radar and confirm that the aircraft that is calling matches the location and altitude as reported by the pilot, thus being able to radar identify the pilot. The pilot told the controller that he was currently climbing to a previously cleared altitude of 12,000 feet and was cleared direct to waypoint Bob Key by the departure controller. The controller then responds back to the pilot to acknowledge they see them on radar and that they are now in control of the aircraft. Further clearances are then issued to the pilot.
Canadian Express 480, radar identified. Climb and maintain flight level 280, proceed on course.
The final filed altitude of flight level 280 is now approved. By stating proceed on course, the pilot is approved to fly to the final airport following the approved flight plan unless otherwise advised by ATC. In this manner, the center controller does not need to approve the pilot to proceed to each individual waypoint in the flight plan. The pilot is still required to stay at altitude 28,000 feet along the route. Next, we will hear the handoff from one center controller to another center controller as the pilot is nearing the border between the two center-controlled airspaces.
Canadian Express 480, contact Toronto Centre now on 125.77.
Toronto Centre, 125.77. Thank you, good day. Canadian Express 480. Toronto Centre, Canadian Express 480 with you, flight level 280, 10 miles east of Torney.
Canadian Express 480, radar identified flight level 280, expect runway 24 right, Ragged 3 arrival, Torney transition, descend via the star.
24 right, Ragged 3 via Torney, Canadian Express 480.
Canadian Express 480, contact Toronto approach on 132.8, have a good day.
Toronto approach, 132.8, thank you, Canadian Express 480.
So we just got handed off from one center controller to another center controller, and the Toronto center controller gave some pertinent instruction to the pilot to get them ready for an approach into the Toronto area.
Canadian Express 480, radar identified flight level 280, expect runway 24 right, Ragged 3 arrival, Torney transition, descend via the star.
First, the controller has let Canadian Express 480 know that he has assumed control for the aircraft, and to let the pilot know that he should expect runway 24 right for landing at Toronto. Further to that, the pilot is given permission to fly the Ragged 3 arrival as filed in his flight plan starting at the Torney transition waypoint and to descend via the stated altitudes at each standard terminal arrival route or STAR waypoint. This would require the pilot to descend to 7,000 feet when crossing waypoint Denka and to be slowed down to 220 knots airspeed. The pilots would then update their flight plan in their FMC to fly the STAR to runway 24 right. Once the pilot is on the transition route and back about 10 miles from Ragged, the starting waypoint for the STAR, the pilot was handed off to the Toronto approach controller.
Toronto approach, Canadian Express 480 with you, Ragged 3 for runway 24 right with information Bravo.
Canadian Express 480, radar identified. After Denka, descend 4,000. Cleared ILS, runway 24 right. Approach not below 4,000 until established. Toronto altimeter 29er.
After Denka, descend 4,000. Cleared for the approach, ILS runway 24 right, not below 4,000 until established. Canadian Express 480.
The pilot is now in contact with the approach controller, who gives the following instruction.
Canadian Express 480, radar identified. After Denka, descend 4,000. Cleared ILS, runway 24 right. Approach not below 4,000 until established. Toronto altimeter 29er.
The pilot is radar identified and thus now under the Toronto approach controller's control. The pilot is then instructed that once he passes waypoint Denka at 7,000 feet, he is then to descend to 4,000 feet and not waver from that altitude until he is on final approach and established on the runway 24 right ILS localizer and glide scope. By stating cleared ILS runway 24 right approach, the controller has authorized the pilot to make the final turn from the downwind termination waypoint, DTW, towards the final approach control fix, or FACF, and proceed to make the approach and descent following the localizer and glide scope. If the controller does not give the clearance for the approach, then the pilot must continue to fly the heading depicted on the STAR from the DTW, and then he will likely receive vectors to get back lined up for the approach. This can happen when the airport's very busy and the controller is having difficulty keeping separation between aircraft. Lastly, the controller gave an updated altimeter setting to the pilot so that the pilot could check his barometric pressure setting on the altimeter and adjust if necessary. The controller will keep control over the pilot until the controller is satisfied the aircraft is well lined up for the final approach.
Canadian Express 480, contact tower on 118.7.
Tower on 118.7, Canadian Express 480. Toronto Tower, Canadian Express 480 with you established, 24 right.
Canadian Express 480, winds 230, 15, runway 24 right, clear to land.
Copy the winds, cleared to land, 24 right, Canadian Express 480.
Canadian Express 480, welcome to Toronto. First available right, contact ground on 121.9.
Exit right and over to ground, 121.9er, Canadian Express 480. Toronto ground, Canadian Express 480, clear of 24 right on Charlie 4. Request taxi to gate 122.
Canadian Express 480, taxi gate 122 via Charlie 4, Charlie, Alpha, Alpha Kilo.
Charlie 4, Charlie, Alpha, Alpha Kilo, Canadian Express 480. Toronto ground, Canadian Express 480, shut down at the gate. Thanks for the service.
Canadian Express 480, copy shutdown. Flight plan closed at 2100 Zulu. Have a good day.
Now, let's recap that entire IFR flight from start to finish, uninterrupted.
Montreal clearance delivery, Canadian Express 480, Boeing 739 with information Alpha ready to copy IFR clearance to Toronto.
Canadian Express 480, Montreal delivery, good day. Cleared to Toronto Airport via the Trudeau 2 departure, vectors to Bobkey, flight planned route, expect runway 24 left, squawk 4501.
Canadian Express 480, Trudeau 2 departure, vectors to Bobkey, flight plan route, expect runway 24 left and squawk 4501.
Canadian Express 480, readback is correct, contact ground on 121.9er for pushback and start.
Roger, 121.9 for pushback and start, Canadian Express 480. Montreal ground, Canadian Express 480, ready for pushback and start.
Canadian Express 480, pushback and start approved, call for taxi.
Copy push and start, we'll call for taxi, Canadian Express 480. Montreal ground, Canadian Express 480, ready for taxi 24 left.
Canadian Express 480, runway 24 left, taxi via Alpha Mike, Alpha, advise holding short, runway 24 left, altimeter 29er83.
Runway 24 left, taxi Alpha Mike, Alpha, advise holding short 24 left, altimeter 29er83, Canadian Express 480. Canadian Express 480, holding short 24 left, ready to go.
Canadian Express 480, contact tower on 119.9er.
Tower 119.9, Canadian Express 480. Montreal Tower, Canadian Express 480, holding short 24 left, ready to go.
Canadian Express 480, airborne called departures 12465, winds 239er at 8, altimeter 29er83, clear takeoff, runway 24 left.
Copy the winds, departures on 124.65, clear for takeoff 24 left, Canadian Express 480. Montreal departure, Canadian Express 480, passing 1500 feet, Trudeau 2.
Canadian Express 480, radar identified, passing 1,500. Turn right, heading 280, direct Bobkey on course, climb and maintain 12,000.
Climb and maintain 12,000, right 280, Bobkey on course, Canadian Express 480.
Canadian Express 480, contact Montreal Center on 128.77, good day.
Center on 128.77, Canadian Express 480. Montreal Center, Canadian Express 480, with you climbing for 12,000, direct Bobkey.
Canadian Express 480, radar identified. Climb and maintain flight level 280, proceed on course.
Flight level 280, proceed on course, Canadian Express 480.
Canadian Express 480, contact Toronto Center now on 125.77.
Toronto Center, 125.77. Thank you, good day. Canadian Express 480. Toronto Center, Canadian Express 480, with you flight level 280, 10 miles east of Torney.
Canadian Express 480, radar identified flight level 280, expect runway 24 right, Ragged 3 arrival, Torney transition, descend via the star.
24 right, Ragged 3 via Torney, Canadian Express 480.
Canadian Express 480, contact Toronto approach on 132.8, have a good day.
Toronto approach, 132.8, thank you, Canadian Express 480. Toronto approach, Canadian Express 480, with you, Ragged 3 for runway 24 right with information Bravo.
Canadian Express 480, radar identified, After Denka, descend 4,000. Cleared ILS runway 24 right. Approach not below 4,000 until established. Toronto altimeter 2989er.
After Denka, descend 4,000, cleared for the approach ILS runway 24 right, not below 4,000 until established. Canadian Express 480.
Canadian Express 480, contact tower on 118.7.
Tower on 118.7, Canadian Express 480. Toronto Tower, Canadian Express 480, with you established, 24 right.
Canadian Express 480, winds 230 15, runway 24 right, clear to land.
Copy the winds, cleared to land, 24 right, Canadian Express 480.
Canadian Express 480, welcome to Toronto. First available right, contact ground on 121.9.
Exit right and over to ground, 121.9er, Canadian Express 480. Toronto ground, Canadian Express 480, clear of 24 right on Charlie 4. Request taxi to gate 122.
Canadian Express 480, taxi gate 122 via Charlie 4, Charlie, Alpha, Alpha Kilo.
Charlie 4, Charlie, Alpha, Alpha Kilo, Canadian Express 480. Toronto ground, Canadian Express 480, shut down at the gate, thanks for the service.
Canadian Express 480, copy shutdown. Flight plan closed at 2100 Zulu. Have a good day.
Of course, the last case study assumes that we were taking off and landing at controlled airports. We will look at one last case study for when we are flying IFR, but we are taking off or landing at an uncontrolled airport. In that case, we follow the same steps as with IFR sequence of flight, with the exception of the contact that would normally be made with airport-based ATC positions, as they don't exist at that airport, of course. All of the conversation happens with the center controller. Once the initial contact with the center controller has been made and the flight plan has been discussed, the center controller will issue a clearance as follows.
Time is now 1800 Zulu, clearance valid until 1845 Zulu. Switch to Unicom for departure, call back this frequency airborne.
The controller has identified the current time and has given the window in which the aircraft must taxi and take off in this case a 45-minute wheels up window. If the pilot had not taken off prior to the clearance expiry time at 1845 Zulu, then they would not be allowed to take off unless a new clearance was granted by the center controller. Since the airport is not controlled, the center controller will not issue any taxi instructions or an actual takeoff clearance. The responsibility for keeping separation from other aircraft on the ground during taxi and takeoff lies with the pilot, who will be announcing his intentions on Unicom to ensure he is not in conflict with another pilot looking to land or take off the same runway at the same time. The controller, since he cannot see the runway, he or she can only issue one clearance at a time, so it's important for the pilot to be expedient on the ground and contact the center controller airborne promptly. Also, in the event they can't make their flight for whatever reason, let the center controller know promptly so that they can cancel the clearance and issue clearances to other pilots if need be. Once the center controller has descended the aircraft to approach altitude for the uncontrolled airport, they will issue an instruction as follows.
Cleared for an approach. Switch to Unicom for landing, call back this frequency down and clear of the runway.
Again, since the airport is not controlled, the controller cannot issue a landing clearance for a specific runway. Rather, he will issue a clearance for an approach. This means the pilot is responsible to pick a runway best to align with winds and then announce their intentions over Unicom frequency to avoid other pilots that may be looking to land or take off from the same airport. Let's recap the information that we've presented here today. First, we will determine whether we need to be in contact with ATC. Look at the type of flight plan that we intend to file. If it's a VFR flight plan, then we need to check if the airports we're flying to or from are controlled airports. If they are, then we need to be in contact with ATC. If the flight plan is an IFR flight plan, then we must always be in contact with ATC. The only time you don't need to be in contact with ATC is when you're flying VFR to and from uncontrolled airports. We can tell if airports are controlled or not, as controlled airports always have a control tower and a control zone that is Class B, C, or D airspace and is depicted in a blue airport symbol on VFR sectional charts. Uncontrolled airports are depicted with a magenta airport symbol on the charts. Once we know the status of the airport, we contact ATC starting with the clearance delivery position. If that position is not staffed, then we move up the hierarchy of control to the tower, next to approach departure, and finally to the center controllers in sequence. While the language of ATC may sound a bit odd at first, remember, it's just a controller and a pilot talking with each other in a manner that is clear and concise as possible while not losing any essential details of the conversation. The preceding material doesn't cover off all of the possible jargon that will be used by air traffic controllers, but it can be boiled down into a few easy to remember key points. Pilots make initial contact with each new controller and tells the controller just the pertinent information that the controller needs to know or what the pilot is requesting. ATC then reviews the requester information and then will issue instructions back to the pilot. The pilot is responsible to acknowledge instructions as given by the air traffic controllers by reading back the instructions. An excellent reference titled VFR Phraseology is available on the NAV Canada website. It can be found by typing the following URL link into a web browser. The link is also included in the section below. As well, there's always the option to connect to VATSIM at a location where ATC is present, and then just listen in on one of the active channels to hear the jargon that the pilots and controllers are using, and in no time, you'll have it all down pat. So guys and gals, that's it for this Canadian Xpress training video. If you like the video, give us a thumbs up. Subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this. And until next time, blue skies, and we'll see you in the next video. From Canadian Xpress 480, over and out.